In addition to issuing subpoenas for top Trump White House officials, the House January 6th committee is seeking information on private citizens involved in the riot that day. National security expert Elizabeth Goitein writes about the tricky precedent Congress could be setting by accessing people's records. She writes, quote, "If we acknowledge that Congress is capable of abusing its powers and infringing on the rights of Americans, it follows that Americans need a better way of enforcing those rights than the law currently provides." And Elizabeth joins me now with more. She is the co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Elizabeth, welcome. So the House committee charged with investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol has sent 35 letters to telecommunications and social media companies requesting that they preserve all records from that day. What exactly are they asking for?
Sure. Well, let me start by saying that Congress has and should have very robust powers of inquiry under the U.S. Constitution. But the Constitution also requires Congress to exercise these powers in a way that respects the fundamental rights of Americans, including the Fourth Amendment right to privacy. And these letters that you asked me about raise some questions about whether current rules and practices adequately protect those rights. The 35 letters in question to phone, internet, and social media companies ask the companies to preserve records pertaining to a large number of people. We don't know exactly who all these people are, but the letters state that they include everyone who applied for a permit or was otherwise involved in organizing, funding, or speaking at the rallies in DC on January 5th and 6th. So that means that they are not limited to the people who actually participated in attacking the US Capitol. They also sweep in people who were in DC lawfully exercising their First Amendment right to protest. And the letters seek information that is some of the most personal and sensitive information that people can generate. They ask the companies to preserve the content of emails and text messages and voicemail messages, as well as geolocation data. And ordinarily, when the government seeks to obtain data that sensitive, it has to go before a court and show probable cause that the person has committed a crime. But under the committee's rules, the committee can issue a subpoena for these types of information as long as they may be relevant to its investigation, which is a much lower standard. In fact, it really places no limits on Congress's ability to obtain this information.
So let me just ask you, you talk about how Congress is asking for the records of essentially anyone who gathered on January 6th there, even those who protested peacefully. Without accessing all those records, how do authorities differentiate between peaceful and violent protesters?
Well, the job of Congress is not to differentiate between the peaceful and violent protesters. Congress is not responsible for law enforcement. In fact, Congress is not allowed to engage in law enforcement under our separation of powers. That's for the FBI. And the FBI has powerful investigative tools at its disposal to discover who engaged in criminal activity and to prosecute those people. And indeed, as we've seen, there have been many prosecutions that have been brought already. So I just want to be clear that Congress is not trying to convict anyone of a crime. Having said that, there are all kinds of ways that Congress can get information about what happened on January 6th, short of subpoenaing the private communications content of citizens who are not known or suspected to have participated in the actual attack on the US Capitol. And part of the question here is whether Congress should exhaust other less intrusive alternatives, for instance, before it actually reads the emails of private American citizens who, again, are not at this point suspected of any criminal activity.
So House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy says if these companies comply with the House committee subpoenas, that they would be breaking the law. What is the basis of his claim?
Well, first, let me say that if the minority leader is concerned that that would be breaking the law, the solution is not to publicly bully the companies into noncompliance with the subpoenas. There are legal proceedings in place to resolve questions about the legitimacy of the subpoenas. But in any event, the law is a bit unclear, and that's a big part of the problem. There is a law, the Stored Communications Act, that generally prohibits companies from disclosing the content of communications to any person or entity without a warrant. And that would certainly seem to encompass Congress. But obviously, Congress has a different interpretation of the law, and the courts have not yet addressed that question.
All right, and we only have about 60 seconds left, Elizabeth, but how might this January 6th Select Committee set a precedent when it comes to congressional subpoenas?
Yes, that's an important issue here, because if the committee ultimately obtains the communications of protesters using subpoenas under a standard of potential relevance, that will set a precedent for the future. And it is not hard to imagine a future committee leader in a different Congress issuing subpoenas for the emails of Black Lives Matter activists in the course of a purported investigation into Antifa. Whatever scenario you might imagine, easy access to the communications of protesters is not something we should readily support. That doesn't mean that it should never happen, and it doesn't mean that there aren't some subpoenas for communications that might be appropriate in connection with the January 6th attack. It just means that we have to be very careful about what the legal standard is and whether there are any limits on Congress's ability to get this information.
Some really significant questions here on the issue of privacy. Elizabeth Goitein of the Brennan Center. Thanks very much, Elizabeth.
Thanks so much for having me.